Hi, I'm Professor Tina Good, and this mini lecture will finish up our conversation on the creation myths in the beginning of Genesis. And we will have a little discussion of the YAHWIST writer. Then we will pick up with the Adam and Eve story and conclude with Cain and Abel. So let me go ahead and share my screen. And you will see a PowerPoint that I have also posted on Blackboard for your review. First, let's remember what we talked about before when we talk about what is a myth. In this context, we are not talking about the definition of the word myth as something untrue. That is a definition that came down much later. Instead, we are talking about a literary genre known as myth. And that genre is a genre of stories created to explain the unexplainable. It does not mean it is not true. It means that it is a story created within the worldview of that time to explain something that otherwise is unexplainable. Okay, a creation myth, therefore, is simply a subgenre of the myth that seeks to explain how the world or how humanity was created. The Adam and Eve story comes down to us as a YAHWIST story. To get more information on what I mean by a YAHWIST story, see the video on creation myths that focuses on the documentary hypothesis. But you'll recall that J was the YAHWIST group and recognizable by identifying God as the Lord. And the E group identifies God as God. The P group is more concerned with the priestly responsibilities, and the D group is the Deuteronomistic historians. Okay, so the Adam and Eve group is believed to have been written by the J writer or writers, believed by some scholars to have been a woman, which really would have been very fascinating if that were the case, because we would have evidence of women having some interesting rights and freedoms and powers at a time where we did not believe that that was possible. The YAHWIST writer was probably writing between 950 and 850 BCE, and incorporates ancient oral traditions. What do I mean by that? So stories that were, passed on from generation to generation and person to person through, oral traditions, because quite simply, they did not have the technology of writing. And so they passed it down through speech. And these stories were about human prehistory and focused on the origins of God's alienation from humanity. That is to say, the stories that focus around God's alienation from humanity, also a very big theme in Greek mythology. The YAHWIST writer emphasizes the deity's dissatisfaction with his flawed human creations. And the YAHWIST style uses very vivid and concrete details and describes the deity with human traits. That is to say, the Lord in the Adam and Eve story walks in the garden, enjoys the summer breeze, gets angry, gets frustrated, gets sad, and is loving and is nurturing. So these human traits, unlike the God, say in Genesis 1. And of course, these human traits we also see very much in Greek mythology and other mythologies at the time. Okay, so the YAHWIST writer also suggests that the patriarchal society that exists along with the subordination of women, was not a part of the original divine plan, that came about much later on as a result of punishment or frustration from the deity. In that same vein, we note that Adam was actually not a proper name, right? That it has come down in translation as that, but rather Adam is simply Hebrew, for earthly creature or for humanity. In fact, Adam, the man, is actually never named, right? It is an improper noun or a common noun that refers to humanity. Eve is not even named until the end of the Adam and Eve story, where the man names her. So throughout the Adam and Eve story, they really are not named, and they are simply referred to as the man and the woman. The YAHWIST writer is the first writer to compose a continuous narrative of Israel's origin. And the YAHWIST writer is believed to have composed these writings in the southern kingdom of Judah, which I do not expect you to understand right now, but we will talk about this later as we proceed through the Old Testament. Okay, so back to the Adam and Eve story. There are 4 characters in the Adam and Eve story. There's the man, there is the woman, there is the serpent, and there is the Lord. Okay, and you'll recall that there is this tree that has been planted in the garden, and the Lord tells the humans that they are not allowed to eat from that tree. They can eat from anything else but that tree. And so they are in the garden and they come across this serpent, and the serpent says, "Why do you not eat from this tree?" And they said, "Because the Lord said we will die if we eat from this tree." And the serpent says, "You will not die if you eat from this tree. Instead, you will gain the knowledge of good and evil, which the Lord does not want you to have, because it will make you more like the Lord." And so the woman decides to eat from the tree, hands the fruit to the man, who then also eats. They do not die, but they discover that they are naked once they have achieved knowledge. They clothe themselves, and pretty soon the Lord is walking through the garden and comes upon them and says, "Why are you clothed?" And they said, "Well, because to hide our nakedness." And he says, "Well, how did you know you were naked? Did you eat from the tree?" And yes, they confess, and then the man blames the woman blames the serpent, and then God doles out punishment for them breaking his rule to them. So we have to consider a number of things, right? First of all, we must not read this through other interpretations, right? We'll get into why these interpretations happen in just a moment. But what we see here is that the serpent is not Satan. Okay, that is a later interpretation that comes on. So in the text itself, as we are reading it, the serpent is not Satan, the serpent is not evil. And the serpent is merely a crafty creature who is more crafty and more shrewd than any of the other wild animals that were created in the creationist story of the Genesis 2. The serpent, however, we notice is able to speak, has the power of language, has the power of persuasion, and knows about this tree, appears to have knowledge, something that the humans do not have. So we have to ask the question, does the serpent lie, right? In fact, that the humans do, in fact, gain knowledge, have knowledge of good and evil. It's a little troubling to let them think that nakedness is evil, but more on that at another time. But that they do not die. At least they do not die as a result of eating from the tree, nor do they die in that moment. Why does the serpent have this conversation with the humans at all, right? What is the motivation of the serpent to have this conversation? And why does the serpent specifically have this conversation with the woman? Okay, so these questions, have sort of haunted, biblical scholars throughout the centuries, and many have suggested interpretations and suggestions as to why these things have happened, and those have evolved over time, given the worldview as they progress throughout the centuries. And of course, we have to ask, where is the man during this conversation? Okay, so, we get this, often we get this story where Eve, eats from the fruit of the tree, is persuaded by the serpent, aka Satan, and then she turns around and then seduces her husband to eat, and he doesn't want to be alone without her, so he eats. And we don't see any of that in this story. He just simply eats. And we don't know why they eat. We don't know why they can't eat from the tree. And we don't know why the serpent wants them to eat from the tree. All of these questions continue to vex scholars, and they continue to come up with various answers to this story. I'm not sure these are the questions we should be asking, but nevertheless, they are questions that continue to permeate the societies that often read the Bible. The trees, then, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. We have to ask the question, why is it there? Why can't the humans eat from it? Why create it if it's causing this much trouble? Why create a serpent who has no more knowledge than the humans? Why are all these things there, right? But what we do discover is that knowledge, at least in these opening books of Genesis, is considered divine, right? And then that just causes more questions, right? Why, what hierarchy is suggested here when the deity, right, it has knowledge, and the serpent has knowledge, but the humans do not. And then the woman gets knowledge before the man, right? So what is the hierarchy there? And what do we make of this idea of knowledge being considered divine, right? That is certainly a common trope that goes through at least to the Renaissance, if not more than that. This idea of to be divinely inspired, to somehow it comes from outside of us. This forces another question. Can Eve and Adam be held responsible for their actions prior to gaining the knowledge of good and evil, the knowledge of right from wrong, right? So think about it in this way. We have a God character who's very parental-like, right? And our humans are very childlike, if not toddler-like, if they don't even have the knowledge of right and wrong, right? And so imagine if a parent were to put down, some candy in front of a child and say, now don't eat that, right? What's going to happen? The child is going to eat the candy. Can the child be held responsible, right? If the candy is right there and they don't know right from wrong, can they be held responsible? And so I think most of us would say no, that is not something that we can hold the child responsible for, right? So then who should be held responsible? What we do begin to see, however, is that we begin to see this theme of an arbitrary deity, right, who is protective of his own power. Why do I use the word his in air quotes? So his is actually a translation from Yahweh, right, the Lord. Yahweh actually does not, it's a word that means to be, right? The infinitive to be, the infinitive form, right? There is no subject to be. There is not he is, they are, she is. It is just existence, no beginning, no end, no subject. But because the English language just simply doesn't have, right, a pronoun, right, that or even really a noun that helps us facilitate this understanding throughout translations, it begins to take on this subjectivity, and that subjectivity often is considered male, right? So even though if we were to go back to the ancient term, and that word would be to be, because of translation, it comes down to us as him or his, right? Or a male God, a male being in translation for most cultures. This deity is protective of his own power and is wanting to make sure that the humans cannot become too much like a god. Presumably, they might become too much of a threat, perhaps, or we're not really sure why he doesn't want them to be too much like him, other than perhaps he wants power over them. And then suddenly, right, after they are doled out their punishments, and they are told, in fact, that they will return to the dust from which they were created, there comes another tree in the story, and that is the tree of life. And God says, to whom we don't know, that if the humans eat from this tree, that they will become too much like us. They will become too much like gods. And so they therefore must be expelled from the garden. Okay, so again, why these trees exist at all is a question that we have to ask. But what we begin to understand is that divinity then becomes defined as knowledge plus power, specifically power to create or destroy, and immortality. And that those three things together, therefore, create the divine. And while the humans may have access to it, they are to be prevented from achieving it. Okay. Now back to the idea of myth, right? So what is this story explaining? So this story is explaining so many things, but we get very specific explanations as to what it's explaining, right? When we look at the punishments for violating God's rule. So this is why, right? This is why the serpent slithers on his belly, right? So the idea is like, why does a serpent slither on the belly? Oh, I know, right? Why do humans loathe snakes or serpents, right? Oh, I know, this is why. Why do women have pain in childbirth? Oh, I know, this is why. Interestingly enough, it suggests that none of these things were supposed to be in the original divine plan. Why are women subordinate to man? Oh, here's why. And why must humans toil? Why must they work? Why must they, work so hard in order to survive? Oh, I know. So this begins to explain many things, but it also sets up a construct of God as well as humanity, as well as a societal system in place. So then, of course, the man and the woman have children known as Cain and Abel, right? Everybody has heard of Cain and Abel. And the story goes that Cain and Abel bring offerings to the Lord. Cain brings fruit from the land because that is what he does, is he toils the land. And Abel is more of a shepherd and brings him the firstling, right, of the flock. And for some reason, and we don't know why, God values Abel's selection over Cain. Cain then becomes so jealous and so enraged and so upset that he then kills his brother. Okay, God comes up and says, Cain, where is your brother Abel? And Cain says, I don't know, I'm not my brother's keeper. Perhaps one of the most famous lines in the Bible. And God says, discovers that Cain has killed his brother, and Cain is then exiled, right? Nowhere is there any mention of their parents. And so we are forced to ask, why did the Lord regard Abel's offering over Cain's, right? There's no explanation for this. So this continues the theme of an arbitrary deity, but again begins to set up a hierarchy of valuing the semi-nomadic over agrarian communities. We'll discover why that's important, even as we move into the Abraham and Sarah story. But it also, interestingly enough, begins the theme of valuing the second son over the first. Why this is important, why the YAHWIST, why the YAHWIST would perpetuate this kind of story is interesting, but more on this later in the semester. What we also see is that once the humans were expelled, right, from the Garden of Eden, once they had knowledge of good and evil, that they seem to become more violent. And we begin to see references to sin when we see that the metaphor of sin lurking at the door, right? Cain, as I said, was exiled rather than killed for his crime. The exile is actually considered to be a worse punishment, much like Adam and Eve are exiled from the garden. This is considered to be a worse punishment. But why is he afraid? Why is he afraid? He is afraid that the people will kill him. Well, who are these other people? Where did they come from, right? If the man and the woman are our original creations, who are all these other people that Cain is afraid of? And so these are questions that go unanswered. What we do begin to see, however, is a nurturing God, a protecting God, right? So even while he punishes Cain, he marks Cain and will not allow him to be killed by these other people. Of course, with the exile of Cain and Abel's death, we need somebody else to continue this line, and so Seth is born. He gives birth then to the genealogy that eventually becomes the Israelites, right? But unlike Eve, who is given a name by the man, Cain has a name, Abel has a name, Seth has a name, everybody else in the following chapter has a name, but Seth, well, there's actually no mention of Seth's wife, right? And so this is when we must really start looking for the silences in the story. And this is one way that we find to do that, right? And then the final chapter is Genesis 5, which is a genealogy. This is the P writers. You'll remember the P writers write the genealogies, which interrupts the YAHWIST narrative. And provides a genealogy between the man, aka Adam, and Noah and the flood story. But you'll also notice that it only lists the fathers. The women are nowhere in the story. Not only are they not named, but they don't even exist in the story except for some comment about Noah's wives or his son's wives. And we don't see any mention of any character name for women until we come to the story of Sarah and Abraham in Genesis 12. So this pretty much concludes our myth. We are still going to be interweaving myth through some of our stories as we proceed throughout Genesis. You'll certainly see it in the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11. But this pretty much wraps up, especially our creation stories. What I think you will see also is that these first 5 stories of Genesis introduce many of the primary themes that are repeated, explored, sometimes even challenged throughout the Bible. But in the end, perhaps what they do for us more is cause more questions than answers of the unexplainable. I hope you have found this video interesting, and I look forward to sending you more videos and seeing your responses on your homework assignments. Have a good day.